Thomas froze with an apple pie still steaming in his hands as his son's voice ripped through the kitchen, spitting out venom meant for his wife. He called his own father a useless old man and bragged about celebrating in Paris once he was gone. The sweetness of the pie turned to poison in that moment, the warmth of family collapsing into betrayal, colder than ice. Every word cut like a blade, and behind his calm stare something darker began to rise. What he did next would shock everyone. Subscribe now and drop a simple comment with your state or even just a number. Thomas stood frozen in his kitchen, the pie cooling untouched, the silence pierced only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He pressed play again as if his mind refused to accept what his ears already knew. Andrew's voice was steady, casual, almost bored, calling his father a useless old man and dreaming of Paris. Each replay carved deeper into Thomas's chest, as though the son he once carried on his shoulders had driven a knife straight through his heart. This wasn't anger yet. It was disbelief, the raw ache of a man realizing the boy he raised no longer saw him as a father, but as a weight to be cut loose. The kitchen around him blurred. He could see flashes of another time, a ball game under the summer sun. Andrew's small hand gripping his own as they ran for ice cream after a home run. He could hear the laughter of a child who once shouted, "You're the best dad ever," without hesitation. That voice was gone now, replaced by something cold, something hungry. Thomas lowered himself into a chair, the phone still glowing in his hand, and stared at the pie. He had baked it with love, humming to himself, imagining the smile it would bring. Now it sat there like a symbol of his foolish hope, a cruel reminder that he had been preparing a gift for a son who was already planning his funeral. His chest tightened with a strange blend of grief and humiliation. Neighbors saw him as the strong man who kept his home pristine, who fixed his own gutters and shoveled his own driveway. Yet here he was, alone at his table, blindsided by the betrayal of the one person he thought he could trust. He whispered his late wife's name into the empty room, his voice breaking as he asked her memory if she had seen this coming. The roses she planted outside swayed in the evening breeze as if they carried her answer, though he wasn't ready to hear it. What burned most wasn't just the insult, but the clarity of the plan. Paris wasn't a careless phrase. It was an arrangement already set, a celebration already imagined. It meant Andrew and Laura had spoken about this often, had dreamed about the money they would inherit, had measured their father's life in dollars and expiration dates. Thomas clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. The pie smelled sweet, but every breath of it made his stomach twist. He rose slowly, walking to the study where Robert's photograph rested on the shelf. He remembered the last conversation with his wife before she passed her warning that money could twist even the most loyal hearts. He had dismissed it then, unwilling to believe his children could ever turn so callous. Now her words came back sharp as glass, undeniable. He set the phone down, rubbed his eyes, and steadied himself. What Andrew thought was a secret plan had now become evidence, and Thomas was not a man to be erased so easily. He exhaled slowly, almost a whisper, as he stared at the silent phone on the table. This betrayal was not the end. It was the beginning of something else, something Andrew could never have predicted. And what Thomas would do next would leave scars no inheritance could ever heal. The night pressed heavy against the windows as Thomas stood in the kitchen, staring at the roses swaying faintly in the dark. His late wife's roses, each bloom a memory of her careful hands and soft laughter, seemed almost to bend under the weight of his whisper. He spoke to her as if she were still standing there, her apron dusted with flour, humming the way she always did when she baked beside him. But there was no answer, only the hollow echo of his own voice. Grief, that old companion he thought he had tamed, rose again with merciless strength, wrapping itself around him, until even the air felt too thin to breathe. The house, once alive with the chaos of family dinners and the stomp of his son's sneakers up the stairs, now felt cavernous, every shadow a reminder of absence. The photos on the mantel glared back at him like ghosts frozen in happier times. Andrew, with a missing tooth, grinning beside his mother. Birthday candles lit cake crumbs on his face. Thomas's throat tightened. The boy in that photo had trusted him, adored him. That boy had not yet learned how to measure his father's worth in bank statements and property deeds. The loneliness was sharper than he remembered, cutting deeper, because this time it wasn't born of death, but of choice. His son was alive and still. Thomas had been abandoned, traded for the promise of luxury hotels and inheritance money. He drifted into the living room and sank into his recliner, the leather cool against his skin. This chair had been his refuge during the long nights of his wife's illness, when he sat awake listening to her breathing, afraid it might stop at any moment. He had survived those nights with the faith that Andrew would carry forward the love they had built. Now he saw how naive that faith had been. He reached for the remote and flicked on the television, letting the light spill across the room. But the voices of strangers did nothing to soften the silence. The walls seemed to close in the familiar creak of the house, turning sinister, as though even the beams and floorboards knew he had been betrayed. The ticking of the clock grew louder, marking not just the passing of time, but the countdown of illusions stripped away one by one. Thomas rubbed his temples, weary from the weight pressing on him. He wanted to believe that somewhere inside Andrew there was still that boy who once begged him to stay at the park for just one more inning, who clung to his hand crossing the street, who whispered, "I love you, Dad," before falling asleep. But the voice message proved otherwise. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw his father as a dying investment. Outside, a breeze rattled the branches, petals scattering across the yard like fragments of the life he once had. For the first time since his wife's funeral, Thomas felt truly alone, not just widowed but orphaned by his own blood. Yet as he sat in that silence, grief slowly shifted, hardening into something else, something colder. And what grew inside him in that moment would not wither like roses in the wind. Thomas sat motionless in the dim glow of the lamp, the silence in his home broken only by the slow hum of the refrigerator down the hall. The voice message had cracked something inside him, but now the fragments of memory began to fit together in a shape too sharp to ignore. He thought back to Andrew's visits, the ones that used to feel like lifelines but now seemed rehearsed, scripted. His son's eyes hadn't been warm in months. They had been measuring, scanning the way a surveyor looks at land before cutting it into lots. He remembered the way Andrew lingered by the oak bookshelves, casually asking what an original set of hardbound classics might fetch at auction. He thought of Laura's polished smile as her fingers trailed along the china cabinet, whispering how such craftsmanship could be updated beautifully. At the time, he had convinced himself it was admiration. Now he saw it clearly: appraisal. His life, his belongings, his history reduced to price tags and resale potential. The worst memory struck with a sting: those glossy brochures left carelessly on his table, promising freedom from chores, a vibrant community, and the comfort of knowing every need would be met. He had laughed them off at first, telling Andrew he was too young to be shuttled into a retirement village. But Andrew had pressed, insisting the big house was too much for one man to handle. Laura chimed in about safety, about how he'd surely be happier painting watercolors with strangers than tending to the roses his wife had planted. At the time, Thomas had dismissed their persistence as concern. Now the truth bared its teeth. It wasn't worry. It was preparation. His stomach churned as he recalled the afternoon Andrew had leaned close, his tone deceptively gentle, suggesting a financial advisor could protect the nest egg. Nest egg, he had said, as though his father's life savings were already cracked open and waiting for greedy hands. Thomas clenched his fists at the memory, his pulse quickening as every moment of supposed kindness twisted into something darker. He rose from the recliner and crossed the room to the desk where his late wife's meticulous files still sat. Opening the drawer, he pulled out the folders, each one labeled in her precise handwriting. Property deeds, insurance policies, investment accounts. He flipped through them with steady hands, and for the first time in weeks he felt a strange calm. His wife had been right. She had insisted on safeguards, had warned him of what money could do to people, even their own blood. He had smiled at her caution then. Now he saw it for the foresight it was. The house groaned in the night, the sound of wood settling, but to Thomas it felt like the house itself was warning him. This was no longer grief alone. It was revelation, cold and undeniable. His son's mask of devotion had slipped, and behind it was something hollow and dangerous. Thomas closed the folder and set it down with care. He had been blind, but not anymore. And what he realized in that moment was only the beginning, because suspicion was giving way to resolve, and resolve had a way of turning into action. Thomas spread the papers across the desk, the yellow lamplight catching the edges of signatures, notary stamps, and the careful notes written in his wife's hand. She had prepared for storms he had never wanted to imagine, and now her foresight stared back at him like a lifeline from beyond the grave. Insurance clauses, property deeds with hidden safeguards, investments split in ways that left him control even if others tried to circle like vultures. For the first time, the fog of grief gave way to something sharper. Anger slid into his veins, hot and undeniable. He had been living as though love would protect him, as though loyalty was a bond unbreakable. But here in black and white was proof that she had known better. She had known what greed could do. She had known perhaps that even Andrew could be tempted to see his father not as a man, but as a sum total of assets waiting to be claimed. Thomas's jaw clenched until his teeth hurt. He could almost hear his wife's voice, calm but firm, warning him not to ignore the signs. The more he studied the papers, the clearer it became. His sorrow, once an ocean threatening to drown him, boiled down into something concentrated, something that burned instead of suffocated. He saw the truth without disguise. His son's affection had always come with a price tag. Every dinner, every visit, every carefully worded suggestion about downsizing or safety had been another calculation. He was not family to them anymore. He was a vault, a deed, a line item on a future spreadsheet. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. Rage throbbed in his temples. He had paid for baseball uniforms, college tuition, the down payment on Andrew's first house. He had cut corners on himself so his son could live without worry. And this was the return being reduced to a walking bank account whose expiration date was already circled on someone else's calendar. But beneath the fury was something else, something alive. Awakening. He felt it stir in his chest. Not grief this time, not despair, but a steady pulse of clarity. He was not helpless. He was not at their mercy. The safeguards were there for a reason, and now he saw that reason plain as day. He had power more than Andrew and Laura could ever guess, and he would not spend his last years waiting for them to strike. Thomas leaned back, breathing hard, his hands flat on the desk. His wife had left him the tools. All that remained was the will to use them. He no longer saw himself as a victim abandoned by both death and betrayal. He saw himself as a man with choices, with weapons disguised as paperwork, with a chance to turn their greed back on them. And in that realization, anger became resolve, and resolve sharpened into a plan they would never see coming. Thomas moved through the house like a man rehearsing for war. He polished the dining table until the wood gleamed, not for pride, but to remind himself of all the mornings he had sat across from his boy, pouring syrup over pancakes, listening to dreams about baseball championships and science fairs. Now that same table would bear witness to something else entirely. He set out 2 chairs, his hands steady though his heart thundered, and let the silence of the room harden his resolve. The bitterness that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally found shape. He imagined Andrew's familiar grin, the one that once radiated innocence, but now looked like calculation, spread across the same lips that had called him useless. He could almost hear the tone, casual, convincing, sliding into conversation like a salesman. "Dad, this house is too much for you. It's time to think about the future." Thomas clenched his jaw, the air around him heavy with expectation. He would not be blindsided this time. He went to the cabinet, pulled out the silverware Laura once adored, and laid it out piece by piece. Each fork, each knife, each spoon caught the light like polished armor. He pictured Andrew's eyes flicking over them, not with fondness but with valuation, as though cataloging what could be sold, what could be kept, what was worth fighting over once the old man was gone. The thought churned Thomas's stomach, but it also fueled his determination. This would be the stage, and he would no longer play the role of silent provider. Walking into his study, he checked the folder again, the one he had placed carefully on the edge of his desk. Inside were copies of his will, freshly updated, ironclad in language that Andrew would never be able to twist. He touched the cover with a calm certainty. It was no longer grief that defined him, but strategy. He was ready to look his son in the eye and strip away the mask of devotion. As the hours crept by, he rehearsed his words. Not desperate pleas for love, not questions asking why, but cold statements that left no room for argument. He would tell Andrew what he had heard, what he knew, and then show him that betrayal carried consequences. The idea didn't soothe him, it sharpened him like steel against stone. When the doorbell finally rang in his imagination, Thomas pictured himself rising slowly, not as the father longing for affection, but as a man ready to deliver judgment. The bitterness inside him no longer tasted like weakness. It tasted like preparation. And as he straightened the place settings one last time, he knew the confrontation was coming, and once it began, nothing between father and son would ever look the same again. The knock at the door was lighter than he expected, almost cheerful, as though betrayal could dress itself in politeness. Thomas opened it to find Andrew and Laura standing side by side, their smiles polished, their arms full of glossy folders. They kissed his cheek like dutiful family, but their eyes slid past him into the house, cataloging the furniture, the rugs, the life he had built. He ushered them inside, his expression calm, though every muscle in his body coiled tight. At the dining table, the one that had held stacks of pancakes and spilled orange juice decades ago, Andrew spread the brochures like a dealer laying out cards. Images of manicured lawns, golf courses, spas, and shining swimming pools stared up at Thomas. Each caption promising dignity for a price, $8,000 a month, all-inclusive. Andrew's voice carried the same warmth he once used to ask for allowance, but now it was laced with rehearsed conviction. Dad, you deserve this kind of comfort. Why cling to an old house when you could live surrounded by people your age with every need met? Laura leaned in, her perfume too strong, her smile too thin. She tapped the page showing a sunlit villa with wide windows. It's safer, Thomas. This house is too big, too lonely. Imagine waking up every morning with friends just down the hall. Painting classes, wine tastings, yoga. Doesn't that sound better than rattling around here alone? Her nails clicked against the paper like claws tapping glass. Thomas listened without interrupting, his hands folded neatly in front of him, but his stomach churned with a rising disgust. They weren't offering him care. They were pushing him out, shoving him toward a cage lined with luxury to make it palatable. Every sentence dripped with false affection, each smile concealing a shove toward the door. He looked down at the brochure again and didn't see comfort. He saw eviction disguised in glossy images and rehearsed concern. Andrew's hand slid across the table, resting on his father's wrist, as if to soften the blow. The market's good right now, he said too casually. If you sell this place, you'll have more than enough. Think of it as an investment in your peace of mind. His words cracked like ice against Thomas's chest. The same house Andrew had grown up in, the house his wife had filled with warmth, was being stripped down to equity in his son's mouth. A wave of nausea swept through him as he realized the depth of the scheme. They didn't see him sitting there flesh and blood, a father who had carried them through every storm. They saw numbers, square footage, liquidation value. He masked his revulsion with a thin smile, but inside the disgust was molten, spreading through his veins. He leaned back, his eyes cold, letting their words wash over him. For the first time he understood completely. Their concern was nothing more than camouflage, their love a sales pitch. And as he sat in silence, appearing thoughtful, a decision began to crystallize, one that would turn their smug confidence into panic. The brochures lay scattered across the table like shards of broken glass when Thomas finally spoke. His voice was steady, almost unnervingly calm, cutting through Andrew's polished pitch. You should know, he said, sliding a folder across the wood, the will has been updated. For a moment Andrew's smile held the kind of forced grin a child wears when caught lying, but Laura's eyes flickered sharp and unsettled. Before either of them could respond, the phone on the table buzzed. Thomas pressed a button, putting the attorney on speaker. The man's voice carried through the dining room, crisp and undeniable confirmation of a new will, airtight filed and binding. The terms were unambiguous. Safeguards were in place. Control rested firmly in Thomas's hands, and any attempt to manipulate him would be met with disinheritance. Andrew's throat bobbed as he swallowed his rehearsed charm, cracking like paint in the sun. Thomas didn't stop there. He reached for his phone again, pulled up the saved recording, and with one tap the room filled with his son's own voice. The venomous words spilled out in cold clarity, Andrew mocking him as a useless old man, promising Laura the fortune would soon be theirs, already dreaming of champagne in Paris. The sound hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The silence that followed was suffocating. Laura's fingers tightened around the edge of her brochure until the glossy paper crumpled. Andrew's face drained of color, his jaw working as though words might come, but nothing did. The man who had once argued over curfews and begged for gas money now sat across from his father, stripped of excuses, exposed by his own carelessness. Thomas watched them both, his expression carved from stone. Inside, heartbreak pressed hard against his ribs, but it was no longer the kind that bent him. It was the kind that forged steel. He looked at the son he had raised, the boy who once held his hand on the way to school, and saw not a child but a stranger blinded by greed. It cut deep, but it also set him free. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "I am not the fool you take me for, and I am not your stepping stone to a Paris vacation." The words landed like hammers, each one driving the truth deeper into Andrew's chest. For the first time in months, Thomas felt the weight shift. The sorrow that had chained him loosened, replaced by something steadier, something unshakable. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't at their mercy. He was in control, and they knew it. He could see it in their eyes, the flicker of panic, the scrambling for a defense that would never come. And as the silence stretched, Thomas realized he had taken back something more valuable than money or property. He had reclaimed his power. What came next would not just be justice, it would be the kind of reckoning they would never forget. Andrew's mouth opened and closed like a fish dragged onto dry land, the color gone from his face. Laura's practiced poise shattered her knuckles white against the crushed brochure in her hand. Thomas let the silence stretch heavy and merciless before he drew the papers toward him with deliberate calm. The new will, notarized and sealed, sat like a loaded weapon between them. His attorney's words still echoed in the air, but Thomas wanted his own voice to be the blade. He looked straight at his son, his eyes unflinching, the same eyes that once softened over scraped knees and late-night confessions. "If you ever try to manipulate me again," he said, his voice sharp as broken glass, "every penny, every house, every account, every piece of land goes to charity. You and Laura will inherit nothing. Not a chair, not a photograph, not a single dollar." Andrew tried to protest, his words stumbling out in fragments. "Dad, you don't understand. We were just... This isn't what it looks like." But Thomas cut him off with a raised hand, the same gesture he once used to quiet a boy who had pushed too far. "It looks exactly like what it is. Greed, betrayal, and now justice." Laura leaned forward, her tone suddenly saccharine, her voice quivering with feigned sincerity. "Thomas, we only wanted what's best for you. We worried about your health, the loneliness." But Thomas's laughter stopped her cold. It wasn't warm or amused. It was hollow, edged with decades of disappointment. "Don't insult me further. I've lived long enough to recognize a sales pitch dressed as concern." He pushed back his chair, the scrape of wood against tile ringing like a gavel. "You deserve exactly what you've earned. And today, that's nothing." The words landed with finality, echoing off the walls that had once carried bedtime stories and family prayers. Andrew's shoulders sagged, fury flickering in his eyes, but there was nothing left to say. Laura looked away, her face tight with humiliation. They had come expecting compliance, a signature on a dotted line, maybe even gratitude. Instead, they were leaving stripped bare, their schemes exposed, their inheritance dissolved into smoke. Thomas stood taller than he had in years, A man unbroken, his grief now hardened into resolve. He gathered the papers with careful precision as though closing the chapter on their betrayal. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt her presence not as sorrow, but as strength guiding his hand, affirming his choice. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, as though the house itself approved of the verdict. Andrew and Laura rose, their movements stiff, their silence louder than any argument. Thomas didn't follow them to the door. He didn't need to. He knew this battle was over, but the war, the true reckoning, was only just beginning. The door closed with a hollow thud, and the house fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to slice through the air. Their footsteps faded down the driveway, but the residue of their presence lingered like smoke after a fire. Thomas stood in the dining room, staring at the empty chairs where Andrew and Laura had sat, their brochures abandoned in a crumpled heap. His hands trembled, not with weakness but with the aftershock of release, like a man who had finally dropped a burden carried too long. He walked back into the kitchen, and there it was, the pie untouched, still resting on the counter where hope had once lived. Hours ago, it had been baked with the warmth of memory, a quiet gesture meant to bridge the gap between father and son. Now it mocked him, its golden crust gleaming under the light, a reminder of the man who had waited, excused, forgiven. That man no longer existed. Thomas reached for it, lifted the dish with both hands, and without hesitation carried it to the back porch. The night air bit at his skin as he crossed to the compost bin, lifted the lid, and let it drop. The sound of the pie hitting the scraps below was dull, final, and in it he felt a strange freedom. He had buried more than dessert. He had buried the version of himself who endured betrayal in silence. Inside again, the house felt different, the air cleaner, as though it too had shed something suffocating. He sat in his study, the updated will secure in its folder, and allowed himself a long breath. The ache in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into something unyielding. Cold resolve. He understood now that blood alone did not guarantee loyalty, and that sometimes survival meant severing ties with the very people you once lived for. The photographs on the mantel stared back at him, Andrew as a child with cake on his face, his wife smiling at his side. For a moment his throat tightened, but he didn't look away. The boy in the photo was gone, replaced by a man who had sold his soul for the promise of money, and Thomas had accepted that truth. What remained was the choice of how to live the rest of his days, not as prey, not as a victim, but as a man who still had power. He rose from the chair and drew the curtains open. The roses swayed gently in the moonlight, their petals trembling in the wind. His wife's garden lived on, resilient, defiant, and he felt her presence steadying him. He whispered a promise into the night, not of forgiveness, but of strength. Never again would he allow greed to write the story of his life. Upstairs the house creaked as if in agreement, the bones of the home shifting under the weight of his decision. Thomas turned off the light, his silhouette sharp against the window. The father who once begged for love was gone. What remained was a man who had chosen himself. And what he would do next would leave a mark no betrayal could erase. Life has a way of revealing truths we sometimes don't want to see, and Thomas's story reminds us that unconditional love should never mean unconditional sacrifice. As we grow older, it is easy to believe that family loyalty will always protect us, but age also brings clarity. Respect must be earned, not demanded through blood alone. Greed can turn even the closest relationships into transactions, and sometimes the greatest act of love for ourselves is the strength to say no. Thomas chose to stop being treated like a bank account, and in doing so he discovered freedom and dignity that no betrayal could take away. For those entering their later years, the lesson is powerful. Protect what you've built, trust your instincts, and never feel guilty for setting boundaries. It is not selfish to demand respect. It is survival. What do you think about Thomas's choice? Have you ever faced a moment when protecting your dignity meant letting go of someone close? Share your thoughts in the comments. Even just your state or a simple number. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart and remind us of the strength we still carry.